Hi everybody, welcome to Radical Civility, a project of Public Square Magazine. Today I am talking to Greg Matsen. He's a new friend of mine. He also runs a podcast, and I heard him talking about Elder Holland, and I said, hey, I like this. This is somebody that I agree with, and also I disagree with, and I think we could have a really interesting conversation. So I emailed him out of the blue, and he was like, okay, and it was great, and we had a good long conversation. The original plan was just to talk about Elder Holland and kind of to give my 2 cents. But then as we got into it, we also started talking about other things, about how BYU could be different, and I talk about my bias as a school administrator and how, like, to me, this was like, we got to teach better, and that gets me excited. And then we talked about other stuff, and it was like critical race theory and politics and, you know, what's wrong with social media and all sorts of good stuff. And on some of it we agree, and on some of it we didn't. I especially enjoyed talking to him about part of what I wanted to talk to him about was the way that we tend to overlay our political beliefs onto whatever's happening in the church. And I wanted to hit that really hard and say, hold on a second, let's back off on that for a second. I think that's the wrong overlay. I think that the reality is that any altar that we worship at that is not our Heavenly Father first is going to get us in trouble eventually. We had a really good chat, and he was really thoughtful, and I appreciated him letting me come on because his podcast has a lot more listeners than mine does. That's part of why we're doing this too. So we're cross-posting to hopefully share listeners, and hopefully it was a good conversation. So thank you to Greg for graciously letting me be on the podcast, and we hope you enjoy it.
All right. Well, Ben, I'm grateful to have you on here. I appreciate your invitation. We have mutual friends, and we have I think, some very pertinent topics here to discuss with very good timing on them. First of all, what we're going to discuss is what people missed about Elder Holland's speech. And there is definitely, I think we might both have some opinions on what is missed on Elder Holland's speech. We're going to talk about the status on the ground, what we're seeing and hearing, probably looking a little bit more about the aftermath and reaction to Elder Holland's speech. We're going to talk about where we disagree on these things, because I know there's probably a couple of points where we're going to disagree on them. And then we're going to talk a little bit about an article that you wrote for Public Square Magazine on neutrality and safety. That's a very interesting topic as well. Let's just start out. Ben, what did you, first of all, let's talk about what you thought of the speech to begin with, not even talking about the aftermath or discussion and the eruption that's come since then. What did you think about the speech itself?
Well, this is going to make me sound like a horrible person. And now because it's after the aftermath, when I was listening to it, I was like, yeah, that was great. Good job. Way to go, man. That was fantastic. Then the aftermath hit, and I was like, did we listen to the same talk? Are we even talking about the same thing? A friend of mine recently said something that I really appreciated. He said, you know, whenever there's a controversy, the controversy will always do violence to the original intent of the subject, meaning that they'll get away from the remarks, they'll get away from the content, they'll get away from the topic, and they'll talk and focus instead on the controversy. And I know that happened in this case, and it tends to happen generally. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, if somebody's listening and they're frustrated by Elder Holland's talk, that's okay. Like, that's fine. But I want to go back to the original talk. I want to go back into what he was saying and also give some of the context for that. I think what a lot of people are missing is this is something that I've been following now, let's see, probably 5 years, right? Because there have been, I don't want to say ongoing issues, but the message from the senior leaders of the church has been pretty consistent. And I think that's
when you say you've been following, what have you been following for 5 years?
Good question. So I'm a nerd. And so I really like listening to BYU devotionals when I have nothing to do. And no normal person does this, right? There's something wrong with me. And so I remember listening to Elder Oaks' talk. I remember listening to Elder Bednar's talk. And I remember listening to Elder Holland when he spoke at the Maxwell Institute. I have followed all of that for quite a while now. And there's a trend between those 3 or 4 talks that's really, really consistent. And what I saw when I stepped back, when I was listening to Elder Holland's talk, I said, that was really good. And when I looked at what was happening in social media, it was like they had picked 1 or 2% of the talk. And again, not judging them for that. If that's sensitive to them, then that's okay. But they were missing the other 98% that, to me, was a much bigger focus.
Okay. And so you felt good about it. I felt the same way. I thought it was an incredible speech. I felt a stronger bond with Elder Holland. I felt, just kind of like, wow, what an inspiration this guy is. And And I'm grateful for his speech, especially because of the things that I've been covering there at BYU as well. Let me give you a little bit of a take, I think, on what I thought about the talk itself. And maybe that leads a little bit to where some of the aftermath came from. I think there were three major things that were covered in that talk. First of all, I think it's important, and this applies to you certainly, where you teach teachers how to teach at BYU Idaho. This was addressed to teachers, and he went in trying to. He said, even though your staff or anything else, I'm going to talk to you as if you're all teachers. That to me is what is being missed here, because I think that what he was covering there was what is being taught and how it's being taught. And I'll get to that in just a second, but I think that's an important thing to understand what the context is, the stage that's set on this. Secondly, I think he was he talked about the doctrine of the family, and that's certainly an issue. That's what, a common point that was brought up on several different examples that he brought up with Elder Holland's talk, et cetera. And some other issues there that were happening at BYU. And now I'm missing what the third one was. I can't remember what it was. Defending the church, right? A lot of people come out and they say, well, he was just talking about defending the church. That's all that it was. I don't think that's true either. I don't think that's the only point that was happening. And you had the examples of the muskets and the trials. We're building up the kingdom while we're also defending it with the muskets. To me, it's the idea of the teaching. And the reason I say that is because if you go back and you look at his talk, you're going to see that he goes in and he talks about, first of all, he talks about the wonderful personal experiences, the thousands of personal experiences that happen that are so special at BYU. They're powerful and they change minds and lives forever, right? So he's talking about these personal experiences. And then he goes in and he talks about, I'm not sure which one this was, but the 2nd century talk by Spencer W. Kimball, and then adding Hugh Nibley's approaching Zion, the first chapter of that, into a friend of his that taught, I think it was the history of civilization. So he's talking about what's being taught, how it's being taught. He uses Spencer W. Kimball and Hugh Nibley as reference points for teaching, right? And the way he said, we're going to teach history of civilization in a BYU way, more or less, is what he was saying. So he's lining this thing up in a way of, to me, it's the pedagogy, right? I'm going to say pedagogy. I think it's the pedagogy of how things are taught and what the experiences are going to be of the students that are there. Just a couple quick more points. I know I'm a little long on this, but he says, in a coming day, the citizens of Zion shall come forth with songs of everlasting joy. This is his friend. I hope our students will hear that chorus and lend their voices. Such are the experiences and then he says, such are the experiences we hope to provide our students at BYU. So that's why he's setting the stage, right, for what he's about to cover here. And then he goes right into, at that point, then imagine the pain, right, from this memo that was sent to him of a mother who was talking about the support. There were many people that were supporting ideas that she says, of many of us that feel are contrary to gospel principles. And then he goes on to, I don't know if it's his friend or a friend of the woman that sent the memo, talking about how a woman was radicalized, as he uses that term, radicalized at BYU, and mentions that it's from some department, and that she thanks the department and several faculty there for helping her to see the light, so to speak. And then she leaves the church because of that. So to me, if you look at that, this is not just about defending the church, and it's not just about the doctrine of the family. That's a very good example, and it's probably the biggest flashpoint, lightning rod there, that the controversy that you have there. But I think this has to do with the pedagogy, the way people are taught, the experiences the students are going to get, and the radicalization. But I get, it's just odd what's happened this year. I get so many letters and I said letters, contact submission forms and emails from parents that are at BYU and BYUI, right? That are and some of them are copies of letters they have sent to the brethren. And so I know exactly what he's thinking, and I think, and what he's reading here. I've seen these things. I've seen what people have written about their kids, right? That have left the church. They talk about how they're mentored by a student or a faculty member there. So anyway, that's the thing. I think the commandeering of the speech. He talks about how wonderful the emblem of the Y is when he was a kid and saw that. Well, that to me is exactly, he's talking about the rainbow that was on the Y. That's what I see, all right, and how that was changed. He talks about the musket fire that was pointed actually at the church at BYU, and then he talks about a couple of stray rounds that went up to Salt Lake. Those are the protests that happened at BYU and then ended up at the front door of Salt Lake. In 2019. That's what I think it is. And so I think one of the things we're missing in seeing what I think he's covering here is this idea of activism. And that changes your idea a little bit on why he would talk about Maddie Easton, for example, as the valedictorian. And, even though it was approved, this commandeering of his speech. What do you think about that?
Well, no, I appreciate everything that you said. Let me put out there very clearly, first of all, that I'm only speaking for myself. I don't represent my institution. This is me just giving my own opinion, and it's meant to be one perspective.
Sure.
My background is as a former school administrator. So I was an assistant principal before I came to teach future teachers. And in that position, I was listening, and I don't think I realized that I was listening, as you mentioned, specifically for some of those assistant principal kind of tick-offs. And the first thing that I heard was, oh, he's talking about teaching. He's talking about pedagogy. So I'm going to share my screen with you just for a quick second here. This is an article that Tad Walsh published right after the address. So I don't know are you seeing the news people missed in Elder Holland's BYU talk?
Got it.
Okay. So he says the apostle issued a formal charge, and he talks about, look at what the content of most of this is. He said BYU should become the acknowledged language capital of the world. He famously said he was hopeful and expectant that out of this university and the church's educational system, there will rise brilliant stars in drama, literature, music, sculpture, painting, science, and all the scholarly graces. He said the university must not be made over in the image of the world. He emphasized quality teaching must be a heavy and primary emphasis for faculty. He noted that an ever smaller percentage of Latter-day Saints would be able to attend BYU as the church grew and became more global, and said those who did attend BYU would have an even greater follow-through responsibility to make certain that the church's investment in them provides dividends through service and dedication to others as they labor in the church and in the world elsewhere. I could go on this. A lot of this is from President Kimball's second century address. It's from Education for Eternity. But what I'm hearing from this is, yes, Elder Holland talked about sexuality. He talked about LGBTQ issues, but that has now taken up all the oxygen in the room, and we're not talking about anything else, right? The context here, in my mind, is that he is, if I can say it this way, there's more going on behind the scenes, because there's a set of talks that were given over the last 4 or 5 years that all line up in this way. And they have asked BYU to defend the family and to defend church doctrine. But they've also asked for a few other things that have been repeatedly hit on. And you mentioned some of them. So the first talk, if I can kind of walk you through this real quick, I hope that's, I don't think it'll take more than a couple of seconds here. The first talk is, and all of these are available, they're all publicly available. This one's called Challenges to the Mission of Brigham Young University. It's by Dallin H. Oaks, April 21st, 2017. And he kind of has 6 major overall points. One is the pressure from the outside going into BYU, meaning that there are external pressures trying to change BYU to make it more like the universities of the world. And President Oaks says, we're trying to deal with that, right? We're going to do the best that we can, but just so you know, that's not actually, that's not the biggest concern. His second point is about internal pressure. It's about people inside of BYU trying to change the mission instead of trying to be changed by the mission of BYU. And that's a phrase that Elder Bednar uses repeatedly, right? Are you here to be changed by the institution or to try to change the institution? Getting to your point about advocacy. And by the way, I'm not saying that all advocacy is wrong. That's not my thing. I'm more politically conservative than that. But I think that at a church university, it's just not the way that things are run, and it never has been. And I think that he is saying something like that. Elder Oaks then goes on to talk a little bit about, I think you mentioned this a minute ago, the place of BYU in all of the church schools. He talks about how BYU is the flagship, but the flagship actually belongs to the group, right? And so it's not just BYU, it's what is BYU allowing the other church schools to do. It's a really cool analogy. He talks through that for a minute. Then his fourth point, he talks about the quality of teaching and how important it is to be better teachers. He talks about how we measure things in the church, specifically teaching and learning. Again, I think you can see why an old former administrator is getting really excited about this. I'm like, this is great. He's telling us we have to be better teachers. He's telling us that research is fine and good, but that cannot be the sole purpose. And in fact, if we are doing research, it needs to tie directly back into how we are serving undergraduate students. The goal of BYU is to be a fabulous undergraduate institution. It's never meant to be primarily a research-based or a PhD granting institution. That's just not the goal or the mission. So that's the first talk. The second talk that I like to reference for people is one by Elder Bednar called Walk in the Meekness of My Spirit. Now, Elder Bednar does this just absolutely magical job of weaving together stories of other senior leaders of the church. He talks about a case with President Eyring where they had a disagreement. And the next morning, President Eyring comes to him and says, Brother Bednar, last night I was rebuked in my prayers. You were right, and I'm sorry. Also, if you haven't been rebuked in your prayers lately, you haven't been praying hard enough, right? This great quote about humility and meekness by President Eyring. Then he talks about President Oaks and a story of meekness from him. And then he reiterates the same 5 points that Elder Oaks had said 6 months earlier. This was a repetition specifically of what Elder Oaks had asked them to do, to defend church doctrine, to be better teachers, to think about how they are measuring all of this stuff. One of them is defending church doctrine, but it's not all 5. Then you fast forward and you go to Elder Holland's remarks at the Maxwell Institute, which I think absolutely play a role in this, where he asked them to be that much more aligned with the work of our Heavenly Father. This is something we've heard from President Nelson when he's given talks on BYU campus. Taking all of this together, especially in the light of Education for Eternity and President Kimball's second century address, you start to see that they are worried about much more than just defending church doctrine on the family. Now, I am also one who will say that to me seems obvious, right? It's okay that they want us to do that. And it doesn't, bother me at all. And that's something that frankly, that's part of why I want to be at BYU Idaho, right? Is because it's a place where I can say like, hey, I think family is incredibly important. And I think the church's doctrine gets it right, and the world doesn't always, and that's okay. And I don't mean to be disrespectful or unkind or anything else, but I don't think that's all that was in his talk. And part of what I see as a concern is that now the only conversation is about that one piece, when it's like, yeah, he was also asking them to do research in a better way. He was also asking them to measure things differently. He was also asking them to improve in their teaching. Elder Oaks, when he originally gave this, I think my favorite was, no success in research can compensate for failure in teaching. And I think that's a part of what is going on here. That's the piece that to me is not being discussed quite enough.
Okay. So we're pretty much on the same page on that, I think, right? And I'm glad to hear you talk about the pedagogy there a little bit, because that's my biggest concern. As I've gone through and done some episodes on what seems to be taught, well, what I know is taught at BYU sometimes. That's a little bit of my concern, and I think that Elder Holland has his ear to the ground on that. It sounds to me like he does, and he's concerned about it. Here's another question for you. He says toward the end of his talk that, let's see here. So he talks about, I hope that all will try and avoid language and symbols and situations that are more divisive than unifying, right? So he's talking, and maybe he's talking about LGBTQ stuff. There could be a lot of different things, right? A lot of different types of symbols. It's not just that. There can be things that are, as I talk a lot about on the podcast about, whether it's critical race theory or intersectionality, there is this tendency in academia that I think that the BYU has to, I don't know how they're going to walk this line. I really don't know, but it is a tendency to pull apart. It's a tendency to be divisive. It's a tendency to assign identities and to accept identities based on race, sexual orientation, heritage, ethnicity, whatever it might be. And I think they see that and they're very concerned about it. I don't know if you've noticed this, but whenever they talk about race or they talk about sexual orientation, they always preempt the talk that portion of it with the idea of the gathering of Israel and or the idea that of an identity where we are all the children of God. And so that ends up superseding everything, right, up top. And then they go in and talk about the evils of racism or talk about, supporting those in the LGBTQ community and making sure we put our arms around them and love them and et cetera, et cetera. But that is always at the top, that there is this, hey, look, there's a lot of different things that we might be, but above all, we can't lose sight of the fact that we are children of God. And I think that when you tie yourself to the symbols and the language and the situations of something else, you start, I think, to start moving that a little bit, right? And we're now looking at each other as ites, and we're looking at each other with, it's hard to have charity in that circumstance. I guess that's what I'm saying.
There's a great talk by Elder Cwic from a recent conference where it's called Hearts Bound Together in Unity and Righteousness. And I find the first paragraph just absolutely stunning. It's so simple, but what he says is, when we are righteous, I'm quoting off the top of my mind, which is always very dangerous, but my recollection is increased righteousness leads to increased unity. Right? That the way that relationship flows is that if we humble ourselves, if we are kind, if we are grateful, if we see each other as children of God, then the unity actually takes care of itself. I love the quote by President Packer. He always used to say, the teaching of correct doctrine changes behavior faster than a study of behavior does. Right? And this is something that I see. The study of correct doctrine changes behavior faster and more permanently than a study of behavior.
Yeah.
So if you want to correct the misconceptions around, any of these things, you can talk about how intersectionality has some things that it has wrong, or you can say we are all children of God. We are all valuable in his sight. Every one of us has a unique and important story, right? And I think teaching the correct doctrine is the way to fix this. One other thing that I forgot to mention, especially in Elder Bednar's talk, but across all of them, he talks specifically about some of the problems that come from importing a system from the world. And what I mean by that specifically is BYU can try to be Stanford, or it can try to be BYU. And over again, what you hear is BYU is only going to succeed if it tries to be BYU. It's not going to succeed trying to be a university after the manner of the world. And one of the things that's repeatedly brought up is this idea of academic vainglory, about worrying more about what you're publishing than who you're helping, about trying to worry about your career ladder and what title you have. And that's something that I think is in my mind, very clearly on the minds of these senior leaders of the church, because they talk about it over and over again. Now, I think that one of the symbols that he was discussing, and this is why I wrote my article for Public Square, is the pride symbol, which has a different context. I need to say this, has a different context at a church school than I think somewhere else. But at a church school, I think that I had to think very carefully about how can I make sure that all of my students feel welcome and safe and like they belong, and also make clear that that doesn't imply that I'm neutral on church doctrine, right? And that I am very much on the side of the family proclamation, and that's okay. And that it's okay to say, you're safe with me, I love you, I care about you. And also at the same time, that doesn't imply that I'm going to go against church doctrine in any way. And I think that's part of the divisiveness in the article I talk about specifically. When you have a symbol like that, then it starts to lead people to wonder, okay, but if they don't have a pride flag, are they safe? And if they do have a pride flag, are they talking bad about the doctrine behind the closed door? And it just leads to this kind of relationship where this suspicious kind of atmosphere, when instead, and this is kind of my key takeaway, if we are Christians, we shouldn't need a symbol that says that we're going to be welcoming and loving and kind and Christian. It should go without saying. Now, the best response that I've heard to that is, yeah, but that's sometimes not true, right? Some people aren't kind and they aren't Christian. And I hear you on that. I'm an old-fashioned kind of guy. I think we should have hard conversations with those teachers, right? I think if you can't be Christian at a Christian university, then that's time to have a really hard conversation. But at the same time, I think that the way to get there is to preach true doctrine and to encourage people to live up to their commitments to be a Christ-like disciple.
You brought up the family proclamation. Elder Holland did not. I thought that was very interesting. He talks about the doctrine of the family, but doesn't bring up the family proclamation. Why do you think that is?
I mean, if I had to guess, I think it's simply because the family proclamation is contentious, and I think he wanted to avoid that concern. He wanted to tie it back to really, really deep fundamental doctrines. I have some friends who disagree with me on this, and they have that right. In my lifetime, the doctrine on the family has been exceptionally clear, and it's the only doctrine that I can think of outside the restoration and the status of Jesus Christ on which all 15 senior leaders of the church have put their name in signature. And so the idea that that's just more kind of an oral teaching, that's oral tradition. That's not really a core doctrine. It just seems out of place. It just seems kind of a little bit silly. It's idolatrous almost. Like we're imagining our own doctrines up in our own minds. I think Elder Holland wanted to get around that completely and not engage in the fight and have people say, well, I don't think that it's really doctrine. I think he tied it directly to, we have a doctrine on the family. And that doctrine on the family is incredibly important to our theology. It's important to us. It's important to the way that we believe. And so he skipped the family proclamation because, if people quibble with the family proclamation, that's fine. The family proclamation represents doctrine that is a key part of our faith and our religion. And I think that's pretty hard to get around.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that he was not using it because it is talking about that proclamation specifically is a bit of a lightning rod. At the same time, he almost strengthened it by saying the doctrine of the family, right? So he I thought that was a wise way to approach that at BYU. What about Matty Easton? What about the valedictorian? That seems to be, that's some people that have a strong reaction against what Elder Holland had to say really focus in on that a lot. Why would you call out this kid? And I'll admit, I mean, everything I've seen about Matty Easton, I've watched several things about him and with him in it. He's like the nicest kid in the world.
Yeah.
A really good kid, really nice kid, but what are your thoughts about that?
So this is tricky because I make it a policy to try really hard not to second guess church leaders, but I also try and make it a policy to be as honest as I can be. And this is one where I'm torn because I think Elder Holland is exceptionally careful with words, and he is, for me to cast stones at somebody whom I admire so much is pretty pretentious, if I can put it that way. At the same time, I think it's okay to be honest and to be as thoughtful and kind as I can be. The way that I interpret this is pretty straightforward. I think that this was a rebuke, but it was not a rebuke to a student. It was a rebuke in a faculty meeting, and that's actually what the meeting was. It was the talk. I don't think Matty Easton did anything wrong, and here's my evidence for it, because he got it approved by a dean. When a dean approves something like that, it's no longer Matty Easton's fault if he stands up and says exactly what was approved. That has nothing to do with Matty Easton. He was fine. Now, I think there's a lot of stuff we can get in there. I know that there are people who are mad that he went on national television and he did, they feel like he was, basking in the limelight a little bit. And it's like, well, yeah, there's no skin off my back.
Right? On the Ellen DeGeneres show, I think that's what you're talking about. I still thought he was not, he wasn't. I still don't think he was negative about things. He brought up the honor code, and maybe there's a little bit, but I think that's kind of some prepping by their staff there at the Ellen show. And I did not see him as being abrasive.
I agree. And every interaction that I shouldn't say interaction I've had with him, I see him on Twitter, right? He and I have never interacted in any way. I think that was one part of the talk that was hard for me, because I'm thinking, ooh, he's probably feeling like he is being singled out. And the interpretation I had was, I'm listening to this whole talk and it's one after another. This is what we need you as faculty to do better. We need you as faculty to do this. We need you as faculty to be better at this. And I think that was the direction that he was going when he was talking about the podium. And I think that he said commandeering the podium, which again, if the dean has approved it, I would say that's on the dean. And so that's kind of my impression. And again, I don't have any interest in attacking Elder Holland, but I also don't have any interest in attacking Matty Easton either. He seems like a really, sharp guy, put together and really kind. And I think if somebody had said, hey, I appreciate it. I see what you're trying to do here. This is probably going to lead to some controversy. Would it be okay if we kept that out? I think he'd probably have been a little disappointed, but probably would have been like, yeah, okay, I get that. That's okay. And I think that's the part that is important to me. And so, yeah, that's my quick take on the Matty Easton piece.
I think I think that's right. I think you're right. I think that the focus was on the faculty. Commandeering is he's saying that, but he's talking to the faculty and saying, look, you're in charge of this, right? This is what you're in charge of. I need you to stand up and make some things, change some things a little bit here. We don't want this going on in the future. The other thing is, again, it's looking at the activation or the radicalization. I really do think this is a big concern for them. And I think that that's just another check on another issue of what he might look at as activism, right? And so, whether it's the why, whether it's the commandeering of the podium, whether it's the protests, that all seems to me to be right in line with everything he was talking about. And I think if we take a viewpoint of, oh, okay, so, and consider, I know firsthand that a number of the faculty were involved in organizing those protests, right? So if you know that, and I'm sure he knows that again, ended up at Salt Lake, that's where I think he's coming from on this. I really do. I think it's just, you just look at it line by line, and every one of the things that he mentioned, every one of these things has to do with this idea of political activation. And are our teachers in any way helping that to happen, right? Are we doing this? And is part of that teaching against the doctrine of the church? And that's where I think that he was coming from on that.
This may be a good time to duke it out, and the part where I'm super rude and I come on your show and I disagree with you. I actually, let me start by agreeing. I think that you're right in a few ways, and there are a couple of ways that I think we disagree on. The part where we agree is I think that there is a danger in. Let me put it this way: I don't worship at the altar of politics. And I am increasingly concerned. Andrew Breitbart was famous for saying politics is downstream from culture. And so he was this big brain that figured out if we can start attacking the culture wars, maybe we can win the political battles more. Except all that happened is that now our culture is just wildly divided and we're angry at each other all the time. Like, you can't watch a movie or a sports game. Everything is now a culture war. Everything is a turf in the culture war. But he was kind of a right-wing thinker who was like, hey, why don't we engage in the culture wars too, like the left does, and then we can start winning more of these battles. Well, I'm going to take his saying that politics is downstream from culture, and I'm going to extend it. Religion is downstream from politics, is downstream from culture. And what I'm seeing is that there's absolutely a political, forgive me for this word, but an infection in our religion where we're starting to see people draw boundaries based on what their political party is. And that's really concerning, right? And everything seems to be pushing us towards factionalizing. And everything that's a culture war debate is now seeping into the church. Now, I want to clarify, I think we are insulated in some small degree. It is not as bad as outside in the rest of the world, but we are not immune to it, right? I think if you talk to 15 people and you just ask one word, and that's masks, you will get a lot of stories of tension and frustration and people disagreeing. And, it's just where we are right now, right? And I think that's a really important thing to be aware of. So in that regard, I completely agree. Where I would disagree with you, though, is I don't think that he was calling out the radical left. I really feel that he was calling out all of BYU. And I'll take it a step further. I have no problem. In fact, I would welcome a class on critical race theory at BYU. Because if there is a bad, concept or a bad idea, the best way to attack it is to teach it clearly, to help people have the tools to investigate it thoroughly and deeply, to create an environment where people can say, okay, is this something that is good? Does it align with gospel principles? And I'll give an example of that. I think there are, when I look at critical race theory, there are some things that I go, that doesn't line up with the gospel to me. That doesn't seem right. That doesn't feel right. There are also a couple of things where I go, I'm really glad that I learned that, because I wouldn't have learned that otherwise. I view critical race theory in much the same way that I view other religions, right? Let me see where I can take as much possible good as I can. And anything that is good or lovely or praiseworthy of good report, I'm going to try and take. And if it makes me want to be better and make the world more just, I am on board with that, right? But if it doesn't align with gospel principles, if it doesn't, mesh with the reality as I see things in the world, then it's something that I'm going to politely, but very honestly say, hey, this doesn't jibe with me. This isn't right. Critical race theory teaches me, for example, that just because somebody claims, just because somebody claims that a system is equal or neutral doesn't mean it actually is, right? There are systems out there. The legal system is one example. Is the legal system equal just because it claims to be? At the same time, you can also, and I see people in this camp where they basically turn around and say, well, I'm a product of my environment. There's nothing that I can do. I basically have no agency because the world is against me. And they throw their hands up. And I think it's a direct assault on agency. Now, to be clear, some of these people really have had a hard time, right? They've gone through awful, awful things. It's just the fact that, like, even if you are a victim, victimization is not a winning proposition. It's not a good way to go. And that's a really hard conversation to have. So that's the piece where I would disagree. If we are going to have professors, I have no problem with a far left professor, as long as he admits, hey, I have some extreme political views. I'm going to teach you mainstream, whatever subject I'm teaching, philosophy. But then I'm also going to offer a section on, Marxist heterodox thinking, and I would love for you all to attend, and I'm going to preach it at you the best I can, but it's been labeled, you know what it is, and you have the tools to attack it or agree or disagree. I think that's a much more honest framing of what I would love to see a little bit more of.
So my response and rebuttal on that, a couple of things. So first of all, I do agree with you on the political identity part and how our culture is really dividing up, and it's concerning on that. And honestly, in most cases, I don't have a political home. I really don't. I'm not a conservative. I've never claimed to be a conservative. I don't have a political party. I've been independent for over 30 years. I don't want that. I don't want that identity. Honestly, that's as far as you think about I don't want the identity of that. And that doesn't mean I don't agree with a lot of things that might come through a conservative platform, but there's some things I agree with on a liberal platform, right? And so I do try to stay away from that as much as I can. I get a lot of response on the critical race theory and social justice stuff I do, and I'll have a lot of people that say, they go after the libs or the liberals, or something like that. That is, it does nothing. It's nothing. All you're doing is, again, dividing between groups. And that, again, to me, is exactly what those ideologies actually want you to do. And so it is pull you apart. So I agree with you in respect to, not wanting to divide politically and being concerned about that. And I think I don't know how we're going to turn it around yet. I mean, because we're going down a very dangerous, not just in the US, but in the church. It's going down a very dangerous path right now with things. It's still out on the fringes, but it's with social media. You're always preaching to the choir, and you're getting a lot of support on your views. But what I would say is, as far as calling out the far left, I don't think he was calling out the far left. I didn't say that. I think that he's calling out radicalization. Right, extremism. So as an example, let's say that there were all of a sudden a number of professors on campus at BYU that were teaching white nationalism, right? This is what Zion and gathering Zion really is all about. And having our own state, so to speak, and having, a white nationalist, backing and using their whatever discipline they're teaching, and filtering that through that idea and that ideology. I would say the exact same thing. And I think that Elder Holland would also, if there are teachers that are radicalizing people into white nationalism on a far right level, I think it's the exact same thing, but that's not happening. So it's not necessarily that it's directly that he's attacking the far left. He's attacking the pedagogy, right? Which is the radicalization. And I see three things with critical race theory, for example, right? There's an indoctrination, which has to do with the pedagogy. It's how am I going to help you think, and how should you look at the world, right? That's one of them. The second is facts and knowledge. And that's where people get stuck, I think, with critical race theory a lot, is they think it's just, you need to focus more on some of the bad things the U.S. has done in the past in history. And especially in the K-12 area, they think that's what critical race theory is, and it's not. But the third one is activation. And that is a major part of critical race theory. And that's what people don't realize, is that the pedagogy is part of that is you must act. You must get involved. This is something like the church, like the gospel, that says, I demand your mind, heart, and your soul. And when you start doing that, that becomes a very dangerous thing. So I agree that, yes, it's not directly to the far left. It just so happens that the far left is the one that is mostly radicalizing students and academia, right? I mean, you can just look at academia more broadly. That is the ideology, is a critical social justice. They're critical theories, not just critical race theory, that academia is getting more and more almost lockstep on what they're doing. And that's what's coming into BYU, and it naturally would. So that's how I would, the words I use a lot. That's how I would parse that out a little bit. One more thing on your teaching of critical race theory at BYU. I would say this. Marxism, I'm sure, is taught at BYU. I would imagine that you go into political science, you have Marxism that's taught, and I have zero issue with that. I wish it was taught way more, so that people could really see what this is, right? What many of these current ideologies have pushed back a little bit on, but are still basically rooted in this area. So I wish that was taught a lot more. The difference is this: who would teach it? Right? Who would teach it? Is it somebody who is converted to critical race theory and therefore is going to automatically bring in the pedagogy and the activation to everybody in the class and make it a political thing, right? Because that's the issue. It's not, we're just going to teach critical race theory. I don't care if critical race theory is taught. That's not a big deal. I want that. I teach critical race theory. Almost every one of my podcasts that I go over on critical race theory, I'm trying to educate people on critical race theory, right? And go through it. So the question is not, it's kind of like this. If you had someone teaching Marxism at BYU, but they weren't just teaching you about the history and the ideology and the manifesto and where it's evolved to maybe up to today, but they're actually saying that you need to be involved with this. If they're actually saying and teaching this pedagogy that says, look, this is how the world works, and you need to look through the spectrum of oppressor versus oppressed. And then also you need to go out and liberate everyone from the oppressed. That's the difference. That's the problem with critical race theory or any critical theory that is taught. It is those other two aspects of indoctrination and the activation that they're always involved. They're not void from any kind of critical theory.
So I have so many thoughts, and they're all fun. So the first thing I want to say is thank you for the correction on what you said. I like what you said. The concern is radicalization. The concern is not left-wing radicalization. It's right. Either direction. I don't think it is a common problem, but it is a problem. There are some voices on Twitter, for example, that are pretty nasty. And I can't tell if they think they're joking or if they are kind of LARPing as kind of alt-right people, or if they're just kind of trolls and they're attacked. But there are some voices like that. And one of the things that I put in my essay about symbols is pride flags, but also like the very ugly opposite, right? The people who are saying white nationalism or racism, those are not acceptable either. No. And for different reasons, right? I would actually say that the racism is in a different class and for a very, very important reason. So totally agreed on that. And I'm grateful for the correction. The second thing that you said was about activation. And I want to parse this a little bit because I want to make it make sense for me. I like to write op-eds. I like to write in letters to the editor. That's the way that I participate in the system. I've never been published, right? In all the times that I've written in. I noticed a few years ago when there were some protests, somebody asked me why I wasn't going to participate. They said, well, why don't you come to this protest? I said, no, it's just not my thing. And they said, but do you not care about this issue? I said, no, I really do. And they said, well, do you not agree with us? I said, no, I really do. They said, so why don't you come? And I said, well, I just don't really like protests. It's just not my thing. I like to write. That's my thing. I think I have a cultural preference for different kinds of activism, but I'm not sure that op-eds are any different than marching in a protest. I think we just have different preferred methods. Now, I would argue that op-eds are better for different reasons, and I can get into that. What I want to be careful about, though, is saying, I think it's good for professors to be involved. I want to see their op-eds. I want to see those things. There are two key distinguishers to me where it crosses a line into something that I'm not okay with. One is the one you pointed out, which is totally great if you want to protest, as long as it's legal and you're setting a good example, not a big deal. If you're protesting church doctrine as a church employee, that starts to be iffy, right? And that's a concern. And I think you're right on that. The second concern, though, and I think this is a recurring theme, is it doesn't really matter to me which side you are, which altar, whether it's the right-wing altar or the left-wing altar you're worshiping at. If you're not putting God first, that is a major concern. And I see a lot of people doing this, where their God is becoming the altar of politics at which they worship, and that is not the most important thing. And so in that regard, yeah, I am very concerned about that. I'll throw another thought at you really quick. I listened to classic talk by Elder Oaks. It's called, it's called Our Strengths Can Become Our Weaknesses. And it's just this great talk, or maybe it was The Challenge to Become. It was one of those two, I can't remember. And it's just this great talk on becoming better Christians. And then about halfway through, he takes this detour and he says, some of you are raising private armies. Please stop. It was so jarring, because I'm listening to this great message, and out of nowhere he's going, some of you need to stop raising private armies. And then he just keeps going like it's nothing. And I sometimes wonder to myself, man, I can't imagine that was a fun thing to have to throw in there in the middle of the talk. Some of my left-wing friends, wave pride flags and are in favor of drug legalization. And some of my right-wing friends raise private armies, right? Like, I hope that we don't have the problem on the right. And I hope we don't ever have the problem on the, I wish that people stayed in the mainstream. But I think there has been a history of evidence that right-wing radicalization has been a problem. And it tends to happen in very weird, crazy fundamentalist ways. It doesn't hit the media in the same way, right? People who leave to form their own weird cult don't get the same coverage as somebody who is on the left and who's just a little bit progressive as a Mormon, right? I think those two things are a little bit different. I have another thought, but I've talked for a long time, so I'll let you jump back in.
Well, I think the difference on the left and the right in those situations has a lot to do with who's winning in the culture war and who's winning in the institutions, right? I mean, I think it's pretty hard to say that the left has not. To me, the left won the culture war. To me, it's over. That doesn't mean things can't change. There was a World War I, then there was a World War II, right? And I know I'm putting it in like the idea of war, but the culture war has been won by the left. That's how I see it. And they've not only won the culture, but they've won over the institutions. And so there's hardly an institution now left where the left doesn't dominate in those institutions. And so that, of course, it's going to be out there more, right? Because that is really, to use a more of a left-wing academic word, that's the hegemony of our culture right now is the left that has taken over these institutions. So whether it's the news media, whether it's Hollywood, whether it's academia, certainly, there are some very credible surveys out there that show that there are, especially liberal arts schools. I mean, there are 40% of all liberal arts schools in the country do not have a single person that leans right on their faculty. 40% of them. Now, the number is not quite that strong in the rest of academia, but it's moving toward that pretty fast. And so when you talk about BYU, to me, it's a lot easier to say, well, if they're not going to be of the world, well, what world are we talking about? We're talking about an academic world, because those faculty members, they're reading the newsletters, they're reading the papers, they're parts of boards and of groups that are, national or international in academia. And so they're all going to be a part of that in a sense. And so it's like, how do you push that back and say, well, I'm different from all of this in some regards, not everything, of course, but in some regards, I've got to be different from this. So I think it's a lot easier to say that the left is going to be, to me, they dominate on all those things. Secondly, and you know what a good thermometer for that is, a good barometer is, look at the 60s and the cry for free speech on the left. Right. That was a major issue because the right owned the culture. And so, of course, they're asking for free speech all the time. What that really means is, I want our voices heard because you're in power. The right is in power. And so we have a smaller voice. We've got to amplify this more. But now that they've won the culture war on the left, those on the right are the ones that are being shut down, right? And it would happen both ways. I'm not saying that as anything. It happens both ways. The right did suppress the left's voice previously, right? But now the left is doing that to the right. And so free speech is no longer an issue on the left, right? You don't see that happening anymore. In fact, it's the exact opposite because they have control of that. Now, as far as a right-wing activism, I think that usually to me, there's a job for the left and there's a job for the right. You know, you have the right is kind of like order. There's a hierarchical structure. It's the patriarchy. It's whatever you want to call it. There's a certain order, especially in the West, and the right is kind of like, well, we need to hold on to the status quo. We need to hold on to where this is at and hold this order in place. The left's job, and it's an important job, is to kind of throw stones at that and say, look, there's not room for everybody all the time in this order and what's going on here and what's happening. And so they're going to do that, and they're going to try and pull that down and break that down. That's the whole idea of critique and critical and Hegel's dialectic. It's the whole thing is just Derrida's deconstruction. It's pulling all of those things down. And the problem is that the right, to me, will have every bit as an ugly activation. It may be worse as the left continues to march forward down an ideological path. That's my concern. So I don't see a lot of the right activism, but it's coming. I think it's definitely coming, and it will do what it always does. It's a reaction, and it's usually a bad reaction to what's happening to their culture.
It's interesting that you say that. A friend of mine said, some of us opposed identity politics because we lost political battles. Some of us opposed identity politics because we remembered that there is such a thing as white identity politics, and it's really, really ugly.
Yes, it is.
And that identity politics it's better to stay away from generally than it is. And this kind of gets to a point that I was trying to make earlier. I have found that the best answer to critical race theory or whatever, that's a tricky definition, but that if I'm talking to somebody about that, my response is there is such a thing as liberal anti-racism. And liberal meaning old school, old style, liberal, classical liberalism, right? And if you are a believer in critical race theory and this new style of anti-racism, that's fine. We can disagree on some things, but that's okay. But my answer is that I am anti-racist. I do believe that it is wrong. I want to oppose it. I want to make a more just society. And I think the way to do that is through classical liberal ideals, through viewing people as individuals, not through groups, right? To fixing institutions where they are broken, not assuming that they are always broken, even when they seem to be producing some increasingly better benefits, right? Those kinds of things. You made a fabulous point on both the left has captured the institutions, completely agreed. I think I remember reading the statistic that in most departments, it's 90% left-leaning and 10%, except business schools, which are closer to 50-50, right?
Those are the numbers.
And that is not healthy. There is nothing good about that. And I think it also leads, that kind of a circumstance, it's almost like gerrymandering, where it leads politicians to become more extreme, because the 10% feel like they've got a chip on their shoulder and the 90% feel like they can say anything, they're still going to keep their seat. And so it's just not healthy in a lot of ways in that regard. I loved your insight on free speech. It's not actually a left or a right issue. It's a whoever doesn't have it right now issue,
Exactly.
right? The right was always on the side of like, oh, well, we need to be civil and, blah, blah, blah. And then it became about cancel culture when all of a sudden other people were controlling the rules on freedom of speech. Two last thoughts. One is, you mentioned who should be doing the teaching on critical race theory. And I'll give you my honest answer. Here's my background. Here's why I'm saying this. My background was in economics. That's what I studied when I was at BYU. I would consider myself a neoliberal on economics. Like, that's the best way that I can say that I'm a capitalist, right? I'm a capitalist, and I believe in all the privatization of all the things. I don't think that means that I shouldn't be allowed to teach my opinions. I think that what it does mean, though, is that I need to say, first, these are my opinions. I'm going to give you the best evidence I can for them. I'm going to ask you to decide. But second, if you focus on really, really great teaching, then the concern about indoctrination starts to go away. Because my goal is not to get you to think like me, it's to get you to think really, really well. I think that, to me, is the key difference. And if people leave my class saying, oh, I'm totally not a capitalist like that guy, totally works, fine, not a problem. But I have taught you from as honest a perspective as I can, the best way that I possibly can. So anyway, that was just my thought as you were talking. Only other thing that I wanted to talk about is current status on the ground, but I'll let you respond to that real quick.
No, I agree with that 100%. I have no problem. Like I said, I think I teach some critical race theory, and I don't have any problem with someone teaching critical race theory. It's just like Marxism. I mean, if it was just a matter of, let me show you the history of this, and let me show you the tenets of this, and let me show you how this is being used today, and all these different things, I would have zero problem with that. And that goes right into actually this idea about banning critical race theory in education, right? There's this idea that both on the left and the right, this battle over is CRT going to be infused, especially into K-12, and the argument is completely missing the point right now, because again, like I said before, a lot of people, when it's watered down and it's brought down to an education level, especially education for kids, which is kind of what would you call it? A conservative stronghold, right? Or you've got the parents that are the gatekeepers of what are my kids being taught, right? Not exclusively, of course, but that seems to be, the homeschooling and a lot of other things. Oftentimes that's something more associated on the conservative side. But it's not banning. It's not a matter of banning the CRT. And if you look at the Utah bill, for example, the proposition that was put, the resolution that was put forward by Steve Christensen, it has nothing to do with CRT. It has nothing to do with critical race theory. Everything that is banned in there has to do with a racial superiority. So there's this concern of whiteness and how that's used and all these other things. And so that's what's put in there and is being asked to be banned by the school board. It's not law either. It's simply a resolution. And that's a big difference from the idea of what are we actually teaching and what's actually being put in there. I've read literally thousands of pages of state-approved curriculum for K-12, including the worst offenders that I've seen so far are probably California and Illinois. And I'll tell you, man, it's not, let me show you the facts behind this. It's just not. I could give you 100 pages of quotes that would scare you to death, right? That don't have to do with, let me tell you how this theory works. It's a misnamed. Critical theory and critical race theory is misnamed. It's not a theory, right? It's not a theory of, oh, this is the theory of evolution. This is how we think all this worked, and here's all the evidence that kind of supports that. That's not what it is. Right? It is a way of life. It is a, when you read these things, you see it is purely activation to the little kids. And they want people to become activated. And it's a worldview. It's an ideology. I liked a lot what, going along with what we were talking about you talked about the, Spencer W. Kimball and Elder Bednar and Elder Oaks, at the time, Elder Oaks and I think Elder Maxwell, Elder Holland, going through and talking about, kind of bringing them all together to kind of get some context at what they're talking about at BYU. You can go back to Elder Oaks' talk in October 2020. This was right after, all of the Black Lives Matter protests and everything that was going on there. And he does a great job. And I'm starting to use this more and more now. I have an episode I actually called on this called Clear Thinking, right? Because he talks about clear thinking, and he says, look, you got to look at these things in a certain way. And it's like you said about, looking at a person as an individual. He says, of course, all Black Lives Matter. And he put up on his presentation, Black Lives Matter. He actually put that right up there, right? I think it had a hashtag on it too. And he says, look, of course, Black Lives Matter. And we, we're all children of God. And he kind of prefaced that again with the whole idea of children of God. And this is in a talk about racism, right? His talk is titled, has something to do with rooting out racism, for that President Nelson had talked about. And he says, however, we've got to be careful as to, what else is associated with this, what else is brought in, what other ideas and issues and policies are brought in with this. And he calls it clear thinking. We want to make sure that our Black brothers and sisters are loved and we have our arms around them and that they know it. But everything else that is associated with this does not necessarily go along with that. Right. So he calls that out directly. And I think that it's, to me, the same idea with critical race theory. I can look at, because intersectionality is a big part of critical race theory. It was brought about by Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined critical race theory and in the 80s. And so she's bringing in the same idea of what she has with critical race theory with everything, right? All these different identities with intersectionality and bringing them together. But there are some things you can look at. Oh, well, this group seems to struggle more with this. And this one over here doesn't have as good test results. And this group over here, doesn't have the same employment levels or, whatever it is. Those are good things to look at. But that data is not critical race theory. It's just not what it is. And I think we have to look at those things like teaching critical race theory with clear thinking and understanding what is behind it and what is the DNA of this and what ideas and policies are closely associated with these things.
I've been really good. And because in my mind, I was thinking we should do another one of these on critical race theory, because now the two are blending together. I'll just say one quick thing on the topic. And that is, when I start talking about critical race theory, what I tend to ask people is, can we define our terms? And the reason is because I think the right, and there's a couple of people in particular, have started saying critical race theory, but they mean anything to do with race that I don't like that is being discussed in society. So if you go, for example, to an equity training seminar, and it's a miserable experience and it's boring and you don't really like it, you're like, curse you, critical race theory. And it's like, that's not actually critical race theory at all, right? That's not related to it. To your point, teaching history accurately in schools, that's just teaching history, right? And if you want to talk about politicization of history and indoctrination, that's fine, but that's not critical race theory either. So then what is critical race theory, right? And so if we can define our terms, then it makes it a lot better. Now, I'm not just accusing the right of that, right? I think Christopher Rufo has kind of openly admitted on Twitter that he is trying to lump all of this stuff together. And I think if I remember right, one of his quotes was, anything that people are mad at, we want to call that critical race theory so that they're mad at this thing. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of become a bogeyman in a way that's really unhelpful, right? And so my podcast is about civility. If you define your terms, it's a lot less scary because I'm not attacking you. I'm not attacking something personal. I'm just trying to figure out what we're talking about, and then we understand each other better. Now, to my friends on the left, yes, I think some people on the right have seen CRT as a bogeyman. Some people have deliberately misconstrued it to be something as scary as possible. And my friends on the left go, that's not even what it is. Critical race theory is a theory. It's a way of viewing the world. It's just a lens. It's an academic theory. That's all it is. And I go, that's right. And it's okay if you critique it. And they say, critique? How dare you? What kind of racist are you? And so you can see that there's two sides that are playing this deliberate misunderstanding game. The right wants it to be a boogeyman. And then the left, if you challenge it, they say, oh, you must just not care about anti-racism. It's like, no, I'm just a liberal guy, right? Like I'm an old style liberal who believes that systems may not be equal, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't work to make that egalitarianism is not a good goal at the end of the day. And so my biggest, because my students ask me this all the time, because they're all scared that critical race theory is going to be something they're either forced to teach, or that, some of them are like, I heard the Republicans are trying to make it so that I can't teach history anymore. What should I do? And my answer is, ask whoever you're talking to, what is the definition that they are using, and then discuss on that basis. And then it's actually a lot less scary, and it's a lot easier to have a meaningful conversation on.
No, I agree with that. I think that what I try to show also is on those things is you got to talk about the tenets. Talk about, break it down and look at what the tenets are here, and then take those one by one and decide for yourself what looks good and what doesn't look good. Because it is, right? It's like, it's I can bring up abortion. So it's like, whoa, wait a minute here, but there's so many different parts of looking at, at that as an issue, right? I mean, from individual rights to consent, right? There's a lot of things that are going to play into that.
And even just knowing that you haven't bit off more than you can chew is really good for the conversation, right? Saying we can't tackle all of critical race theory, but maybe we can cover white privilege. Maybe that's a concept that we can talk about thoughtfully, and I can learn from you and you can learn from me. That's a much more useful conversation. And that one was probably too big too, right? But narrowing it down and saying, let's just take this narrow little bite first seems to be a way that allows people to actually understand each other.
Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to cover on Elder Holland's talk?
Yeah, really quickly. So I want to say a couple of things about what I am experiencing on the ground. And I say that to mean I've got some friends who are at BYU, and I've asked them like, hey, how have things gone since then? So this isn't firsthand. I do actually spend some time at BYU right now, but I don't think it's my place to run around talking about every positive or negative. The general sense that I am getting, though, is captured by a friend of mine who put it this way. One of my professors said that this year he wants to actually begin with a prayer and make it a goal to connect things back to the restored gospel. He opened our class by saying he wants to improve in this way and that this is a new feeling for him. Somebody else talked about how, kind of tongue in cheek, they said, well, I certainly haven't seen anybody aiming to be more exclusionary or to keep kids out or to be unkind to a certain group of students. In fact, if anything, people are doubling down on being more kind and more welcoming and also standing for the doctrine. Now, the only other thing that I wanted to say really quick is that's been my experience. It meshes with what I am seeing. I'm sure there's some grumbling. I'm sure that some people are upset. The only other thing that I would say is that is not what you are hearing if you go to social media, and that's because social media is not real life, right? There was a great survey that I saw recently that found that Twitter is effectively as liberal as UC Berkeley. Right? If you are on Twitter, it's kind of like walking around at Berkeley campus, right? And that's how left-leaning it is these days. And I think that it's really important to remember that. And so, when people post about this, you'll see a lot of stuff on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram that's very progressive, and that's fine. But after I wrote my article and after I've talked to people who are, a little bit more plugged in, a little bit more grounded, I guess I would say, not in social media, not in the cloud, but on the ground. The response has been really positive. The response has been, you know what, we were called to repent in some ways, and we're going to try and do that. We're going to try and be better teachers. We're going to try and be better researchers. We're going to focus on the student and a little bit less on our titles and our aspirations and our vainglory and how many publications we have. And I think that's really important. And again, I think what this made me think about is how can I communicate both that I am unapologetically on the side of the restored gospel and the doctrine of families, and also on the side of any student who is struggling or concerned or worried and that they are safe in my space. Now, you have to define that term, right? Because again, some people say safe and it means three different things. One of the things I say in my essay is you are not, how do I say it? Safe does not mean that I set low expectations for you. Safe means that I'm going to push you as hard as I can academically and spiritually. And I'm not going to apologize for that. But I hope that you feel like I am someone that can come, that you can come to my office and we can, even if you're not sure of things, that I am a place that you can come to if you're struggling. And that feels right to me. And that's my update on the ground from the three friends that I have that are on campus. So don't take this as representative polling here.
Ben, you talk a lot about what you call radical civility, right? Help me with this a little bit. Do you see, and I'm going back to political here, do you see a difference between appropriate civility between the hard left and just the left, and the hard right and just the right? You see what I'm saying? Is there a line there where civility might change, not for the individual, right? Because I think that's an important thing. Is we always want to look at the individual, right, and address that differently from the ideas. Usually, I try to do that, right? You can look at the individual, and then you've got these ideas. I do attack ideas, for example. If I think that this is something that is against gospel doctrine, if I think it is something dangerous, left or right, I'm going to attack the ideas. I'm going to attack the words, right? But I think if you try to separate that from the individuals, is radical civility something that? Well, just tell me what it is. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's a fabulous question. A couple of things. I'm a little bit embarrassed by the term radical because it's all trendy now, right? It's the edgy thing to say. Like, I'm a real radical. And it was, it's kind of a silly thing because it's like, I'm going to be radically nice to people, I guess. I don't know. The reason why I stuck with the title was because, the term radical means, root. I always think of it that way because I was a math teacher, right? And so radical 4 is the same as the square root of 4, right? Getting back to the root of the idea of civility. Civility is not a set of protocols and a set of hoops to jump through. Which fork am I supposed to use first at the dinner table, right? That might be etiquette, that might be rules of other things, but what is the real truth behind civility? It's seeing the other person as somebody worth learning from. It's understanding that other people can disagree with you and that it's still worth engaging with them. I am better for every conversation I have with people that I wildly disagree with. And you asked a question about the extreme left and right, and I want to hit that really hard. In my experience, you have the echo chamber effect for both of them, but then you also have the chip on your shoulder effect, like almost like they're being picked on. And it's like, yeah, that's because people think that you're extremists. And you even would agree that you're an extremist. You talk about how you're a radical, then you're bothered when people call you a radical, right? You have a chip on your shoulder about it. Some of the answer to that is to expose yourself to more people that aren't like you, that go, actually, that seems really extreme to me, right? We talk a lot about guilt and shame these days, and I have a really very controversial take. I think some shame is good. It's just a community signal saying, hey, you're kind of wacky, you're kind of out there a little bit. We want to pull you back in. Now, that doesn't mean you should go shaming people, but it's a natural part of being in a community. And when somebody says,
wait a minute, measure that with tolerance, Ben.
Oh, so here's the reality, and this is a really tricky one to communicate. My Catholic buddy thinks I'm going to burn in hell, and he's really nice to me, and we get along fine, right? It's not an issue. And if he tries to bully me or harass me or mock me in public, that's going to be a problem. I'm going to be upset by that. But he is completely civil. He listens to me when I speak, and I listen to him when he speaks, and we disagree on really, really deep fundamental issues. I love what Arthur Brooks said. Civility is. He didn't say civility. I'm putting that in there. He said, we must learn to disagree better rather than disagreeing less, right? Our job is not to simply stop disagreeing with each other and to retreat. I call this the civility paradox, where all the sensible people have left Twitter. Anybody with a heart and a brain is going to say, I'm not going there. Those people are crazy. Well, what does that leave Twitter, right? It leaves it crazy, and it's a terrible place. And it's, a friend called it a hellscape, and I don't think he's wrong. Well, one of the easiest things you can do is just go on Twitter and say something normal and not totally insane and kind of centrist and thoughtful. Try to, instead of a hot take, take a cold take, right? Give somebody, hey, I thought about this for a couple of days and I had this insight. What do you think? You look like a genius when you're on Twitter because everything is so polarized and wacky. I think civility is the issue of issues, because the way I define it is civility is the rules of the road that allow you to engage with other people. And when you engage with other people, you are balanced by them. They rub off on you. They make you better. They make you think in a different way. The reason why we are coming apart in at least some part is because we don't have good enough rules for the road. We don't know how to communicate around abortion or critical race theory or all of these other things without somebody immediately taking offense or imputing to you bad motives or whatever that may be. Civility is a way of saying, no, I actually care about you enough not to try and score cheap rhetorical points. I actually want to understand what you're saying. I actually want to hear where you're going. And I think that's a really important concept. To your last point, do I think that there's a breach of civility among the radical right and radical left? I'll give you this as a thought experiment. If you go to 4chan, do you think that there are going to be more white supremacists or less? And do you think 4chan has worse language or better language? So I'm going to go out on a limb and say there's at least a correlation. I suspect there's a causation, but there's at least a correlation. And by the way, I think some people that we call racists are just trolls. And I think some people that are actual racists are really polite about it. And so you can't figure out who they are, right? But a lot of the people on 4chan are just like, they just curse a lot, and they just have foul language, and they say awful things to get a rise out of people. I don't think that's good, but it also allows the other people who actually have these really terrible ideas to blend in the background. And it's always fun civility is kind of like freedom of speech. I feel like it's a similar thing. Civility is the weapon you use against somebody who you don't like, right? Oh, well, they're not being very civil. Interesting how it's always the people who don't agree with you that aren't being civil, right? Mm-hmm. It's never my own side, right? It's never like that. And people always say, well, civility is just a way to oppress, whoever's not in power at the time, until they're not in power. And then, until they're in power and they're like, well, those people aren't being civil enough. Respectability politics is really important, guys. So I think civility is key, because it allows, while the whole world is spinning apart, it says, hold on, pause. Let's see if we can come back together a little bit, even on things we disagree with. I disagreed with you a couple of times on this, and I hope it didn't feel, feisty or angry or
Not
anything.
at all.
It felt fun. It was meant to be
an
exchange of ideas.
Yeah. All right. So let's get to your article here and just finish up with that. You wrote an article for Public Square Magazine. The title on this is "You Are Safe in My Classroom: Truth, Belonging, and Pride Flags." Okay. So that should get a good response from people. You go through this thing and you talk about belonging at first, and you talk about creating, I'll say it, a safe space basically in your classroom for the students. And so the first half, you've got all these points that you're running through, trying to show how, hey, I want you to be here. I want you to be able to talk to me. I want there to be able to, an open communication here with us, et cetera. But then you move on in the second half of this, and you go through several points that say to me, it's kind of like, Elder Oak's clear thinking, right? It's like, okay, now let me define a little more what I mean by safe, right? Or safety in this. What brings this about? Why do you think it's a need to talk about this? And what has your experience been looking both at academia and campuses nationwide with their safe spaces, and what you're trying to create in your classroom?
Well, two things on this. You might be getting a very Jonathan Haidt kind of vibe from me about coddling of the American mind.
I like that vibe.
I'm a big fan, right? I think one of my duties, and I say this in the article, is one of my duties is to push your ideas really hard. And if I haven't given them sustained fire, you deserve your money back. So if you come in as a utopian Marxist, wonderful. I hope you leave realizing there are a bunch of holes in that theory. And I hope the same is true of a radical capitalist who agrees with me. I hope that I am pushing both people to think better, and that I am leaving them with tools. That isn't because my room is a safe place. It's a better way to put it is, people should feel safe in my room. Ideas should not. And if I'm doing a good job, I'm going to push on those ideas. It's astounding to me in the field of education how many people come with a set of preconceived notions about how education works and how it should work, and what a great teacher is. I like to make fun of this as the teacher who teaches like their hair is on fire. They have no idea how to teach math, but every day they dress up like a new thing, like a pirate, or like a whatever it is. And the kids just love this. Actually, that's not true. That doesn't happen. Teachers who can't teach, it doesn't matter how much you dress up. If you cannot clearly explain things to children, you're a terrible teacher, no matter how much you dress up, right? So that's one of the reasons, is I wanted to be really clear that there is a healthy amount of strain and stress is part of a safe learning environment. We only grow. I mean, we don't lift weights that are too easy for us, right? It's meant to be a little bit of strain. So that's one thing that I was getting at. Another thing that I was getting at is there are a number of people who are starting to say, well, you can't be safe for someone if you have traditional beliefs about the family. To which my response is, if that's where we are, then that's you, that's not me. I have seen homophobia before. I have seen people mock another child for being gay, or even beat them up or harass them, right? I have seen those ugly, ugly, vile things. I don't think that's the same thing as me believing that a husband and wife having children is the most divine thing that we experience in this life. I think those two things are very, very different. And if you're going to lump them together, that's your definition. That's fine. But that's not where I am. And so the first half of the article is saying, I hope you feel safe, and this is what I want to create for you. And by the way, there are some things I can actually do. I'm committing to do. Sometimes, in class, you hear outdated ideas. You hear, people say things that they probably meant to be really innocent and thoughtful, but they're really not super helpful or friendly, right? I want to make it clear, if I hear something like that, I'm going to call it out. I'm going to do it kindly, but I am going to call it out. And then the second half of the article is calling out the idea that I have to choose between being a Christian disciple or being somebody who is accepting and loving, right? I have to choose between doctrine and being loving, to which my answer is actually, I think being a Christian disciple and being a Christian disciple go hand in hand really well for me, that the doctrine and the welcoming are both part of what drive me as a human being. So that was the purpose of my article. I got a lot of really positive responses. I will say the number of people who reached out to me privately was really high. And the number of people who complained on my Facebook wall was and they were kind and they were gracious, and I appreciated the disagreement, but it was a different set of folks, right? There were people who were, many of the people who reached out to me privately said, I don't feel comfortable saying how much I appreciated your article, but thank you for saying it. And then they just kind of faded back into the background, because what they were trying to communicate was, I believe in the doctrines of the family, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And also saying that I want to be kind and loving and as gracious as I can to these kids. So that was the purpose of the article. I think it went pretty well. Obviously, if you think that, if that's your strategy, then you're going to be upset by that. But I'm pleased with how it went. And the conversations, even with the people that I disagree with, have been fruitful and thoughtful ever since. So I've been really pleased with how that's gone.
You mentioned Jonathan Haidt. So I read his book, I think right after it came out back in 2012 on, I'm trying to remember what it is. I've got it here. The Righteous Mind. Right. So I went over that, and that's actually one of the things. And then I started seeing him on YouTube a little bit, and I followed him on those things. And he was very involved with what eventually I think later became the Heterodox Academy. And so I started following that as well. And that's actually what ties me, because I'm not an academic. That Jonathan Haidt's the one that actually started tying me into academia and showing me, okay, there's some problems here. There's some issues here that we really need to talk about, both on the academic side, the academians, and on the student side that really need to be discussed. But then his book in 2018, The Coddling of the American Mind, was revelatory. It's going into the iPhone and when that came about, and then talking about the social media and helicopter parenting and all these things kind of coming together at once. And there was all of a sudden this big change where now we end up with these safe spaces, right? And so he talks a lot about how if you don't go into the second half of your article, right, then all you're doing is reinforcing basically the offense, right? You're reinforcing the ability to be offended by almost anything. And it's like working out, right? I think he uses that example that it's like working out. You've got, the more you use your muscles, the stronger that they get. If you're not actually engaging in adversity, if you're not actually engaging in ideas that you don't know about or don't agree with, then you're going to be that much more coddled, right? And I think you can look at the same thing. I'm leading to something here. I've got a question for you. I think you can see the same thing in social media for adults, actually. I think that the more you create your tribe, right, and you get the positive feedback and the likes and everything else and the positive comments from your own group that you're preaching to the choir with, you're being coddled to some degree. Right. And whether you're on the left or you're on the right, this is the coddling of America as well, I think. And so we're not engaging as much, and we're not looking at the other side and saying, okay, well, I can agree with this point and this point, but these over here, I'm just not going to do it. But here's why. Right. And you don't get as much of that anymore on this. What is your feeling? I mean, if have you read, you did read The Coddling of the American Mind?
I've seen 3 different YouTube lectures on it, which is a nice way of saying no, I haven't. But okay, I've read enough about it.
I've seen those too. He does cover a lot of those things. So, okay, so do you, putting that into context there, what do we need to do as far as safety goes with kids? Because any parent is going to say, well, I need to protect my kid, right? I want to protect them from any problems. I grew up, I'm an old guy, I grew up, I would have died first if I ever put a bike helmet on right before riding a bike. Are you kidding me? Do you know the harassment I would have gotten? There's just no way I would ever have done that. I never wore a seatbelt. That's very uncool. You don't do that kind of thing back then. Right. So, but at the same time, there are certainly some benefits to a helmet and to a seatbelt, right, that you would want to use. So in your looking forward, at least, or in your experience so far as teaching, how do you balance that out with ideas? How do you balance that out with ideas with the students who seem to be, the Gen Z especially, according to Jonathan Haidt, right, the Gen Z especially, who seem to have a little bit more of that coddling and concern and participation with shaming?
I think that's a brilliant question. So let me start with a little bit of my theology, and that is to say, I think God wants a powerful people. I think he wants to build us as individuals into powerful people. We don't normally think about it that way. He wants to save us, or he wants to redeem us, all of which is important and true and powerful. But I think there's an aspect of the gospel that's really critical, which is that he wants us to gain power over our circumstances and power to do good in the world. And so, a friend of mine, I was talking to him about how hard it is to keep my kids safe from, bad stuff, images, pornography on, I was playing a game on my phone, right? Just a stupid, time waster game. And a commercial popped up and I was super angry about it. It was just gross, right? And my kids didn't know what it was, and so they didn't really notice, but I was just frustrated, right? Like, I should have protected them better from this. Like, why can't I ever do this? And my buddy just, he said something really thoughtful. He said, you can't possibly protect them. The goal can't be about just protection. Now, you should where you can, but the end goal is to do everything in your power to make sure that they are ready when it comes to them, right? A ship in port is safe, but that's not what ships are designed for. And so when I'm teaching students and when I'm teaching my students in classes, I want them to be exposed to ideas that they're not going to agree with. I want them to feel that friction of ideas and know what to do with that. I would even go that way with the gospel. I want my own children to know there are some really serious things out there that they need to confront and be able to wrestle with. Now, another person that talks on the same topic who I quite like is Jordan Peterson. Now, Jordan Peterson is easy to mock, whether it's the
lobster.
The lobster thing, or he's just kind of a weird guy, right? I really like his stuff though, and part of it is because fabulous. I see what he says is really good, especially for some young men who need that responsibility. Make your bed. Like he's kind of a father figure in some ways. But one of the things he talks about really thoughtfully is in his first book, he has a whole chapter on take controlled risks. Give children chances to scrape their knees, not to break their heads. I'm not saying that, right? But give them a chance to fall and be hurt and realize that they were still okay and that they're stronger than that. The goal here is resilience. The goal here is not that they have all of the right ideas from the get-go. I could try and teach my kids, just stick into their heads all the gospel and liberal democracy and capitalism and all the things that I believe in really deeply, and morality and, all of the stuff. Or I can make them strong thinkers. And I think that they will get there on their own because I think the evidence is on my side. And if not, I should change sides. And so I think that once you can articulate that that's the goal, in my classroom, I'm very open with my students. I have opinions, you're going to hear some of them, but my goal is that you think better than when you came in. And some of my ideas because I'm a horrible person, I'm going to push just to make you think. I was yelling in class because I raise my voice when I get excited. And we were talking about, traditional public schools, and somebody made a comment about, well, part of the reason why I'm really glad we have them is this thing. And I can't even remember what it was. And I said, yeah, good thing we don't have that problem anywhere else. And everybody looked at me like I said this horrible, horrible thing about public schools. And I was like, guys, I'm just trying to push your thinking. Like, it's okay. Like this is what we do here. And when they know that, they actually appreciate it because it's still safe, but the ideas are not safe. And your old self is not safe. And so one of the key concepts that I really believe in is God wants powerful people, and he wants to give you power over your circumstances. And I think that's also a Jordan Peterson kind of a thing, right? Take an aspect of your life, gain control over it, make your room beautiful, right? This is such a weird thing that he talks about, but it's so powerful. Find a room in your house and make it beautiful. Then the next day, try and aim for 2 rooms. And all of a sudden, you'll start to realize that you have control over many more things than you thought. And with that power that you have, you can start to, when people realize that you are a capable person, they'll throw responsibility at you because they know you're capable. And when you do well with that, you'll get more and more and more. And I think that's a really, really powerful concept that we don't normally talk about anymore. So that's my long-winded answer on how I try and teach to my students.
No, I appreciate that. Of all the things we've discussed, that's my favorite thing you've said. So I really, if I had kids learning to teach, I would want them, I would want you teaching them. So I really do appreciate it. I think Jordan Peterson is fabulous. And I do believe that we are not ships that should be sticking in port. That is, that is a very a good metaphor for what we ought to be doing. Well, Ben, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, this has been fabulous. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Great. Thanks so much. And keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks. You too. Be well, my friend.